Thumb screws, also known as pilliwinks in Scotland, consisted of metal bars with adjustable screws designed to crush the victim's thumbs between two plates. This torture device was widely employed during the Scottish witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries as an interrogation method. The executioner would place the victim's thumbs between the metal bars and slowly turn the screws, increasing pressure until the victim either confessed or their bones fractured. The crushing sensation was reportedly excruciating, and many victims suffered permanent nerve damage and deformity. However, unlike execution methods, thumb screws were designed to extract information while keeping the prisoner alive for subsequent trial or punishment. Death from this torture was extremely rare. I've placed this at the beginning because it represents the least severe option. The pain is temporary in duration, the damage localized to non-vital areas, and survival is almost guaranteed. Strappado, also known as reverse hanging, was a torture method used extensively in medieval Europe and the Ottoman Empire. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and a rope attached to their wrists was used to hoist them into the air, forcing their arms backward and upward. This position caused the shoulders to dislocate almost immediately, accompanied by the tearing of ligaments and muscles in the shoulder joints. The pain was described as unbearable, and victims often lost consciousness. In some variations, executioners added weights to the victim's feet, increasing the downward pull and causing additional joint damage throughout the body. The torture could be repeated multiple times, with the victim being dropped suddenly and then caught by the rope before hitting the ground, intensifying the trauma to the shoulders and spine. While strappado was primarily used for interrogation, victims who endured prolonged sessions sometimes suffered permanent disability in their arms. Tongue removal, also known as glossectomy, was practiced across multiple cultures from antiquity through the medieval period as punishment for specific crimes. Those convicted of blasphemy, treason, spreading state secrets, or making false accusations against nobility faced having their tongues cut out. The procedure involved restraining the victim, forcing their mouth open, pulling the tongue forward with pincers or hooks, and severing it with a blade or shears. The severity varied. Some victims had only the tip removed, while others lost the entire tongue down to the root. Blood loss during the procedure could be significant, though it was rarely fatal if cauterization was applied immediately. Victims survived but were permanently silenced, unable to communicate verbally and often facing social ostracism. Infection remained a risk in the days following the removal, and some victims died from complications, though this was not the primary intention. The Judas cradle, also called the Spanish cradle, was a pyramid-shaped torture device where the victim was suspended above a sharp wooden or metal pyramid by ropes. The executioner would slowly lower the victim onto the apex of the pyramid, which was positioned beneath the victim's anus, vagina, or perineum. The pointed tip would gradually penetrate the body cavity as the victim's weight pressed down. The torture could last hours or even days, depending on how slowly the executioner lowered the victim and how much rest was allowed. Sometimes the pyramid was oiled to make penetration slower and more agonizing. The device caused deep internal injuries, severe bleeding, and often resulted in death from infection or blood loss if the session continued long enough. The psychological component was equally brutal. Victims remained conscious throughout, fully aware of the gradual penetration. Persian boats, a variation of scaphism but less extreme, involved confining victims in hollowed-out logs or narrow boats. The condemned person was placed inside with their head, hands, and feet protruding through holes. Executioners force-fed them milk and honey, which induced severe diarrhea and the mixture was also smeared across their exposed body parts. The victim was then left floating on a stagnant pond or lake under the sun. Over the course of several days, the combination of their own waste, the sweet substance attracting insects, and exposure to the elements caused intense suffering. Flies, wasps, and other insects would swarm the victim, biting exposed flesh and laying eggs in wounds. The victim typically died from a combination of dehydration, infection from insect bites, and septic shock from sitting in their own waste. This method could take up to a week, though most victims died within 3 to 5 days. The Colombian necktie, also known as corte de corbata, emerged in 20th century Colombia during periods of political violence and drug cartel conflicts. This execution method involved making a deep horizontal cut across the victim's throat, then pulling the tongue down through the wound so it hung outside like a grotesque necktie. The victim would often still be alive when this was done, experiencing both the cutting and the pulling of their own tongue through their neck. Death came from blood loss and asphyxiation as the throat filled with blood. Beyond the immediate physical horror, this method served as a psychological weapon. Bodies were left in public locations as warnings to rival groups or to terrorize communities. The visual impact of the mutilation was designed to create maximum fear among those who discovered the bodies. The method represents a modern continuation of ancient brutality. The blood eagle, attributed to Vikings in Norse sagas, was described as a ritual execution reserved for enemies who had committed particularly egregious offenses against Viking leaders. According to the descriptions, the victim's back was cut open, and the ribs were severed from the spine with an axe or sword. The rib cage was then spread outward to resemble eagle wings, and the lungs were pulled out through the opening while the victim was potentially still conscious. Salt was sometimes rubbed into the wounds. The sagas describe this as involving extreme mutilation and slow death from shock and blood loss. The ceremonial nature suggested deliberate prolonging of suffering. Whether the accounts represent actual practice or exaggerated storytelling meant to enhance the fearsome reputation of Viking warriors. The described method combines anatomical destruction with ritualistic cruelty. Chinese water torture, also known as dripping torture, involved restraining the victim in a position where they could not move their head, with a mechanism set up to drip water onto a single point on their forehead at regular intervals. The drops fell continuously for days or even weeks, with the constant dripping creating unbearable psychological pressure. The anticipation of each drop became torturous, and the repetitive sensation drove victims to hallucinations and mental breakdown. While the physical damage was limited to potential scalp irritation, the psychological effects were permanent. Victims reported that the sound and sensation of each drop became amplified in their minds until it felt like a hammer blow. The method was effective precisely because it attacked the mind rather than the body, and many prisoners confessed or went insane before any serious physical harm occurred. Crocodile shears, used in 16th century Europe as punishment for regicide, consisted of iron claws that were heated red hot and used to tear flesh from the victim's body. The device resembled oversized pincers or tongs with serrated edges designed to grip and rip tissue. The most famous case involved François Ravaillac, who assassinated King Henry IV of France in 1610. Ravaillac was subjected to crocodile shears as part of his extended execution. The executioner heated the claws until they glowed and then used them to tear flesh from Ravaillac's chest, arms, thighs, and calves in a methodical sequence. Each application removed a chunk of muscle and skin, causing extreme pain and blood loss. The process was repeated across multiple body parts, with the executioner working systematically to maximize suffering before the victim died from shock or blood loss. The entire ordeal lasted several hours, during which Ravaillac remained conscious for a significant portion. The brazen bull with live animals was a variation that combined burning with animal attack. The standard brazen bull was a hollow bronze statue, shaped like a life-sized bull, with a door on the side for inserting the victim. A fire was lit underneath, gradually heating the metal until the interior became an oven. In this enhanced version, executioners would place live animals inside the bull, along with the victim before sealing the door and lighting the fire. As the temperature rose, both the human and the animals would panic. Rats, cats, or dogs placed inside would claw and bite at the victim in their terror. While the heat intensified around them, the victim experienced simultaneous burning and attack, unable to escape either torment. The bull was designed with acoustic pipes that channeled the screams through the bull's mouth, creating sounds that resembled an actual bull's bellowing. Steam would emerge from the nostrils during public executions. Rat torture involved placing a cage or metal container with one or more hungry rats onto the victim's abdomen or back, then applying heat to the exterior of the container. As the cage heated up, the trapped rats would panic and begin burrowing through the victim's flesh to escape the heat. The rats would claw and chew through skin, muscle, and eventually organs in their desperate attempt to find an exit. Victims remained conscious throughout much of the process, able to feel the rats moving inside their body cavity. The method could take hours, with death eventually coming from blood loss, organ damage, or septic shock. In some variations, multiple rats were used simultaneously, or the process was repeated on different parts of the body. The psychological horror of feeling animals eating their way through your living tissue matched the extreme physical pain. This method was used in various cultures, with documented cases in medieval Europe and reportedly during 20th century interrogations. The pear of anguish, also known as the choke pear, was a metal torture device shaped like a pear that could be inserted into the mouth, vagina, or anus. The device consisted of leaf-shaped segments that were closed during insertion but could be expanded via a screw mechanism turned by the torturer. Once inside the body cavity, the segments would slowly open, stretching and tearing internal tissue. The oral version was used on heretics and those accused of speaking blasphemy, the vaginal variant on women accused of adultery or sexual crimes, and the anal version on men accused of homosexuality. As the device expanded, it caused internal lacerations and permanent damage to the soft tissue and muscles of the orifice. The pain was described as unbearable, and victims often passed out from shock. If the pear was opened too far, it could rupture internal organs or cause hemorrhaging. Even if the victim survived the immediate torture, infection from the internal wounds was almost guaranteed. Molten metal ingestion was an execution method where molten lead, gold, or silver was poured directly down the victim's throat. This method was used in various cultures, including ancient Rome and medieval Europe, often as punishment for corruption or treason. Corrupt officials who took bribes were sometimes executed with molten gold, representing their ill-gotten wealth, destroying them from within. The molten metal, heated to temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit, would sear the victim's mouth, throat, and esophagus immediately upon contact. As it traveled down into the stomach, it would burn through the stomach lining and surrounding organs. Death came relatively quickly, usually within minutes from shock, asphyxiation as the throat swelled shut, or cardiac arrest from the extreme trauma. However, those minutes were filled with unimaginable agony as the victim's internal organs were literally cooked. Sawing was an execution method where the victim was hung upside down and then sawed vertically in half, starting from the groin and moving upward. The inverted position was critical to the method's brutality. By hanging the victim upside down, blood flowed to the head, maintaining consciousness and delaying death from blood loss. Executioners would begin sawing between the legs, cutting through the perineum first. The saw would progress slowly upward through the pelvis, abdomen, and chest cavity. Victims typically remained conscious until the saw reached the chest or neck area, meaning they were aware of being divided in half for a significant portion of the execution. The executioner could control the speed of sawing to prolong the agony, sometimes taking hours to complete the process. This method was used in various cultures, including medieval Europe and parts of Asia, often reserved for crimes considered especially heinous. Public executions using this method drew large crowds. The breaking wheel, also known as Catherine's wheel, involved tying the victim's limbs to a large wooden wheel and then systematically breaking their bones with an iron bar or hammer. The executioner would follow a specific sequence, typically starting with the lower limbs and working upward. Each blow was calibrated to shatter bones without immediately killing the victim. The legs would be struck first, shins, then thighs, with multiple blows to each segment. Then the arms would receive the same treatment, followed by strikes to the ribcage and spine. The goal was to break as many bones as possible while keeping the victim alive and conscious. After the breaking was complete, the wheel would be mounted on a tall pole and displayed publicly with the victim still attached. The broken body would be woven through the spokes of the wheel. Death would come eventually from exposure, dehydration, shock, or internal bleeding, but this could take days. In some cases, executioners were instructed to deliver a final blow to the chest or neck, but this was often withheld. The lead sprinkler was a torture device consisting of a ladle or spoon with small holes perforated in it. The device was filled with molten lead or silver and then used to drip the molten metal onto the naked body of the victim in a systematic pattern. The executioner would start with the extremities, feet and hands, allowing the victim to experience the burning sensation while remaining conscious. The molten metal would adhere to the skin, creating deep burns that penetrated through multiple layers of tissue. As each area was covered with droplets of cooling metal, the executioner would move to a new body part, working methodically across the legs, torso, arms, and finally approaching the head and face. The head was deliberately saved for last to ensure the victim remained conscious throughout the maximum amount of the torture. Death came from shock, infection, or the eventual coverage of vital areas. Coffin torture, also known as gibbet cage torture, involved locking the victim inside a metal cage that was shaped to conform to the human body. The cage was then suspended from a gallows or tree in a public location, exposing the victim to the elements. In many variations, the cage was deliberately made smaller than necessary, forcing the victim's limbs into bent or twisted positions that could not be adjusted. The victim would hang there for days or weeks, enduring sun exposure during the day, freezing temperatures at night, rain and wind. Dehydration and starvation were inevitable as the victim was given no food or water, or only minimal amounts to prolong the suffering. Birds would often peck at the exposed flesh through the bars of the cage, and insects would swarm the helpless victim. Passers-by would sometimes throw stones or rotting food at the caged victim. Some cages were designed with small water collection systems that would allow rain to drip into the victim's mouth, extending their life and therefore their suffering. Death typically came after 5 to 10 days from a combination of exposure, dehydration, and starvation. Cement shoes, also known as concrete encasement, is a modern execution method associated with organized crime in the 20th century. The victim's feet would be placed in a bucket or box, and wet concrete would be poured around them up to the ankles or knees. Once the concrete hardened, the victim would be transported to a body of water and thrown in. The weight of the concrete made swimming or floating impossible, and the victim would sink immediately. As they descended, the victim would remain fully conscious, experiencing the terror of drowning while being unable to move their legs or kick toward the surface. The psychological horror of feeling yourself sinking deeper while your lungs burned for air was as much a part of the torture as the physical drowning itself. In some variations, the concrete was poured around the victim while they were already positioned in a seated or standing position, creating a block that would ensure they sank directly to the bottom. This modern method demonstrates that torture and brutal execution techniques evolved to use contemporary materials. Hanged, drawn, and quartered was the most severe punishment in medieval and early modern England, reserved exclusively for men convicted of high treason. The condemned would first be dragged through the streets behind a horse while tied to a wooden board, a process designed to humiliate and injure but not kill. Upon arrival at the execution site, the victim would be hanged by the neck, but crucially, he would be cut down while still alive and conscious. The executioner would then make an incision in the abdomen and remove the intestines while the victim watched. This was followed by castration, with the removed organs typically burned in front of the victim. The heart would then be cut out and held up to the crowd. Finally, the victim would be beheaded. The body would then be divided into 4 parts through quartering. These body parts would be displayed in prominent locations throughout the kingdom where they would remain until they rotted away. Impalement, most famously associated with Vlad Tepes of Wallachia, involved inserting a wooden stake through the victim's body, typically entering through the rectum or vagina. The critical aspect was the executioner's skill in angling the stake to avoid immediately piercing vital organs. The stake would be carefully positioned to pass through the body cavity without hitting the heart, major arteries, or lungs initially. The victim would then be hoisted upright, with the stake planted in the ground and their body weight gradually driving it deeper. As long as the victim could support some weight on their feet or push up with their legs, the stake would penetrate slowly. Exhaustion would cause the victim to slip down incrementally, each drop driving the stake deeper and causing fresh agony. The pain would force them to scramble back up on already exhausted muscles, only to slip again minutes or hours later. This cycle could continue for hours or even days before the stake finally pierced something vital. Vlad Tepes reportedly impaled thousands of enemy soldiers simultaneously, creating forests of stakes with dying victims that served as psychological warfare. Historical records suggest some victims survived for up to 3 days on the stake. Flaying was the removal of skin from a living victim, a process requiring considerable skill and time from the executioner. The procedure typically began at the extremities, hands and feet, where the skin would be cut and then carefully peeled away from the underlying muscle and tissue. Executioners would work methodically, using sharp knives to separate the skin from the fascia beneath. The skin contains numerous nerve endings but relatively few major blood vessels, meaning victims could remain conscious throughout much of the flaying process without bleeding to death quickly. In some cultures, boiling water was poured over the body first to make the skin separate more easily from the flesh. The process could take hours, with the executioner moving from the limbs toward the torso and eventually the face and head. Victims would die eventually from shock, infection, or blood loss, but the timeline varied based on the executioner's technique and how much of the body was flayed. In certain cases, the removed skin was preserved and displayed as a warning. The Aztecs practiced ritual flaying where priests would wear the skin of sacrificial victims during ceremonies. Lingchi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a Chinese execution method designed to prolong suffering for as long as possible through systematic mutilation. The practice involved making numerous shallow cuts across the victim's body over an extended period, with executioners trained to avoid severing major blood vessels that would cause rapid death. There were multiple documented variations of this method. In one version, the victim would be restrained to a wooden frame, and the executioner would randomly draw knives from a container, each labeled with a specific body part: left forearm, right thigh, left foot, neck, chest. With each draw, a cut would be made to the corresponding body part. This would continue for hundreds of cuts, until the executioner drew the knife marked with the heart, at which point the victim would be stabbed through the heart. Another variation involved tying a tight fishnet around the victim's naked body. As the net pressed into the skin, small portions of flesh would bulge through the holes. The executioner would systematically cut away each protruding piece of flesh, working across the entire body. This process was excruciatingly painful, but avoided major blood loss, allowing the torture to continue for hours or even days. The most extreme variation was reserved for the worst criminals. The victim would be buried up to their neck in the ground, completely immobilized. The executioner would make a deep, cross-shaped incision at the crown of the head and peel the scalp back. Mercury would then be poured into the wound between the skull and the separated skin. The weight and properties of the mercury would cause it to work its way down between the skin and the underlying tissue, gradually separating the entire skin from the body. As the victims struggled against their restraints in agony, attempting to free themselves from the ground, they would essentially crawl out of their own skin, leaving it behind in the hole. This variation could take multiple days. Scaphism, considered by many to be the worst execution method, originated in ancient Persia. The condemned person would be stripped naked and placed inside a narrow boat or hollowed log, or alternatively, sandwiched between two boats that were then lashed together. Only the victim's head, hands, and feet would protrude through holes in the boat. The executioners would begin by force-feeding the victim massive quantities of milk and honey, far more than the stomach could comfortably hold. This mixture induced severe and uncontrollable diarrhea. The same mixture would be liberally smeared across every exposed part of the victim's body: their face, hands, feet, and any other visible skin. The boat would then be set afloat on a stagnant pond or lake, or left exposed to the sun. The combination of the sweet substance and the victim's accumulating waste would attract every insect in the area: flies, wasps, bees, hornets, mosquitoes, and other biting insects would swarm the helpless victim. They would lay eggs in the victim's eyes, nose, mouth, and any open wounds. Maggots would hatch and begin consuming the living tissue. The victim would be unable to wave away the insects or protect themselves in any way. Each morning, executioners would return to the boat and repeat the process, force-feeding more milk and honey, smearing more across the victim's body, ensuring the torture continued. The victim would lie in their own excrement and vomit, unable to move, as their flesh was slowly consumed by insects, and their bodies rotted while they were still alive. Historical accounts report cases where victims survived for 17 days before finally dying. One documented case described a victim whose entire face had become completely covered with wasps. His flesh was described as rotting away in chunks, filled with writhing masses of maggots and worms. Gangrene would set in, and the smell of decaying flesh would attract even more insects and scavengers. Throughout all of this, the victim remained conscious for much of the ordeal, fully aware of what was happening to their body. Death, when it finally came, was usually from a combination of dehydration, starvation, septic shock, and organ failure.